The Chicago Bears hired Buffalo Bills defensive line coach Eric Washington as the new defensive coordinator under Matt Eberflus. Today, we'll hear from the host of Locked On Bills about what Washington was able to do with the defensive line in Buffalo and what we can expect from him in Chicago.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. On the show today, we'll learn more about new Chicago Bears defensive coordinator Eric Washington from someone who's kept a much closer eye on Eric Washington for the last handful of seasons than we have, with Joe Marino from Locked On Bills joining us on the podcast today to go through what we saw from Washington in Buffalo, and then we'll come back with some perspective on things to keep in mind with Eric Washington as the Chicago Bears defensive coordinator and how to sort of think about this move fitting into the Chicago Bears coaching staff and where this defense stands moving forward. Let's jump right in with Joe, and then we'll come back after him with some broader perspective on the hire. All right, joining us now on the Locked On Bears podcast is Joe Marino, the host of Locked On Bills here on the Locked On Podcast Network. You can follow him on Twitter at the Joe Marino. He also co-hosts Locked On NFL Scouting podcast as well, covering the Buffalo Bills in a lot of different places. Joe, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about a Bears new defensive coordinator. I want to start, defensive line coach for Buffalo. What kind of opinion, what kind of feeling do you get around the fan base from him? I feel like a lot of times the fans will have a really strong opinion about even a position coach one way or another. Does he generally have good feelings from Buffalo, or were there times when there were frustrations there? What's sort of the evaluation?
Well, Lauren, I'm starting to think the Chicago Bears might be a little fond of what's going on with the Buffalo Bills defense after bringing over Tremaine Edmonds and now plucking Eric Washington. I would say that the most frequent coach that I was asked about through the years, that's not a coordinator or, of course, the head coach, has been Eric Washington. Because I think there's a lot of, when you bring up the fan base angle on it, there's a lot of fans that I think were pretty disappointed in Eric Washington and really felt like the defensive line continuously underachieved. And I wonder how much of that is tied to the amount of investments that have went to the defensive line for the Buffalo Bills, whether it's cap dollars, whether it's first round picks. The Bills have been pretty aggressive when it comes to building the defensive line. And I think for some of the players and pieces, it took a little time for them to really realize their potential. And so that came back to a lot of questions for Eric Washington. And, is this the right guy? Is he maximizing Ed Oliver and AJ Epinesa and Boogie Basham and, the different players that they were able to bring in, a lot of free agents, whether it's Vernon Butler or Tim Settle or these types of players. I think there was a lot of collective disappointment in thinking that these players maybe should have been better, which led to a lot of fans that had a lot of questions about Eric Washington. And so I try to do my best to be level-headed and reasonable with those people and talking about development. And, each individual player is unique. And, it did take a little time for some of them, but they did realize their potential. So I think if you ask the fan base, I think you probably find a lot of members of Bills Mafia that are pretty happy to see Eric Washington leave.
Where do you fall on that, the quality of the player versus the quality of the coaching? Because when the defensive line struggles, is it that they drafted the wrong guys or signed the wrong free agents and most coaches wouldn't have had success with them, or these guys were good and came here, maybe the free agents were good on other teams and then played worse here, or these guys had higher ceilings in college and played worse here, or went on to play better, the defensive linemen go on to play better somewhere else after they leave Buffalo? Do you get much of a sense of what the actual in Buffalo influence was on some of these individual players?
Lauren, I think we'd have to have probably 10 different conversations about 10 different players, right? Because they're all unique. If it's an AJ Epinesa, it's okay. Second round pick, body transformation, COVID year, takes 3 years for him to do anything, right? Like it's that type of stuff where you look at an Ed Oliver and, all right, well, he's top 10 pick. And so you're thinking, all right, is this the next Aaron Donald? And like, he's okay. He makes some moments. And well, this past year, he's unbelievable. And everyone's like, what a steal of a contract extension that was, so there's just so many different examples of it. They gave big money to Starlo Talele a few years back, and injuries were kind of in the way of that manifesting itself. So I feel like those conversations are they're so important to have on an individual basis. But I think collectively, I think Bills Mafia would tell you that player development took too long under Eric Washington.
Do you have a sense for why they gave him the promotion, the title adding of assistant head coach for just this past season, and why like they didn't have a defensive coordinator but made their defensive line coach assistant head coach?
Well, so now this is where the conversation gets different. I answered your first two questions through the lens of what fans would tell you about Eric Washington. I think generally speaking, the coaching staff was quite fond of Eric Washington, and so were the players. I think if you were to listen to some of them speak, in particular Von Miller, and the way that Von Miller talked about Eric Washington during his time in Buffalo, you would hear rave reviews about the impact and the quality of the coaching there. And Sean McDermott is a coach that believes a lot in trust, and certainly they have their time together dating back to Carolina, and it's a very cohesive process with how they want the front to marry what's going on in the back seven, and so there's good synergy between all of that. And so I think from a fit perspective within the coaching staff, I think that Eric Washington was that trusted piece of the equation and got that assistant head coach label once Leslie Frazier took the last season off. And that put Eric Washington front and center because he was the guy that on a weekly basis kind of did the defensive coordinator interviews and media sessions and that type of stuff. But never had to call the defense or anything like that. So I think, from the players and coaches perspective, I think the perception of Eric Washington's a lot different than maybe what the fans would tell you.
I don't know if this is super impactful for on the field stuff, but how did he handle himself at the podium, being one of the faces and voices of the defense beyond just the head coach? How was that interaction like with the public and the media?
That was a part of the Eric Washington piece that I enjoyed this year, was getting a chance to listen to him, right? Because positional coaches, you don't typically get a chance to hear from them often. I heard from him every single week this past year. And what's funny is as soon as I saw that the Bears were interviewing Eric Washington for their defensive coordinator spot, the first thing I thought to myself was, Eberflus is going to love him. They seem very, very similar to me in terms of like regimented, buttoned up dudes, right? And I think style of defense, right, is also very similar. So whenever that request came through, I thought to myself, I bet you he goes there. And then, of course, it didn't take long for that to happen. So, yeah, I enjoyed that. He's very direct. I think he's very honest. And I think he's, for a regimented coach, he really does seem to have the players at the forefront of his mind. And I could really appreciate a lot of hard questions that he was asked this past season about, like Von Miller. That was a tough situation where coming back from the ACL, and he didn't really perform well at all throughout the course of the season, but he still got opportunities. But, Eric Washington's sitting there taking these questions like, why is he playing? Why does he even have a jersey? And to see Eric Washington give good, honest answers about, hey, it's because of the work that he's putting in and what we see him doing throughout the course of the week to position himself to be the best player that he can. And he's earned those opportunities. I thought he handled a lot of that very, very well. So I enjoyed listening to Eric Washington on a weekly basis this year.
This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the better way to play daily fantasy sports because Prize Picks put you in complete control over your success. Other daily fantasy platforms, you're setting your lineup against 1,000 other people's lineups. You got to get first place to really win anything of note there. But with Prize Picks, you pick 2 to 6 players and whether they'll perform better or worse than their Prize Picks projection. So it's just you versus the house, and you can win up to 25 times your money just by getting your picks right. So whether you were doing it for the championship games this weekend or certainly looking ahead to the big game, it gives you a little something extra to have some stakes and watch how these players are doing in football or across all of sports. They've got Prize Picks available, and it's a lot of fun. Try it for yourself. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Joe, if we take a step back for this Buffalo Bills defense, Leslie Frazier steps down, steps away, steps from the kind of on his own choice last season. Why more broadly did the Bills not promote a defensive coordinator? I think we saw the same kind of thing happen in Chicago this season, more abruptly in season when their defensive coordinator resigned for very, very different reasons, but they opt not to promote someone within. And we kind of had a feeling that, okay, if they're not promoting anyone from within at that point, then none of those guys are going to get the defensive coordinator job because they could have just promoted them earlier. Well, why didn't Sean McDermott do that for his own defense, even if it's not Eric Washington?
Oh, I'm sure it comes down to control, right? Like he wanted to have control of that defense. Yeah, and unfortunately, the trends continued this year in the postseason with their disappointing loss to the Chiefs, where the Chiefs looked like the Chiefs for the first time all season long, right? But I think it was a situation where if you go back to the Bills' previous 3 postseason exits, it really came down to a defense let them down against Houston, against Kansas City in the AFC Championship game, and then against Cincinnati. And you're just like, well, the defense in these elimination games is just not showing up, in particular, the defensive line. And then, of course, here we are. It's literally like Groundhog Day, where the Bills against Kansas City in the divisional round, they certainly had a bunch of injuries in the back seven. I have a lot more grace for the defense this time around. But once again, in that big moment, they just didn't have it, right? And in particular, your defensive line was the piece that was the healthy unit this year, where you thought, okay, can this defensive line make up for missing out on your top 3 linebackers, your top 3 corners, right? And they couldn't. So it's a little bit of Groundhog Day, but I think it was a control thing for Sean McDermott. He's like, all right, if we're going to go down with bad defense against the Chiefs in the playoffs, well, let me be the guy that's coordinating it.
Obviously, Eric Washington is just plugging into a Bears defense that already has the staff and the system more or less in place, and he's just a piece of this. But I know a lot of Bears fans are kind of wondering, like, okay, what kind of influences did he have in Buffalo that he might then influence? Kind of Buffalo system was he in Buffalo that's going to influence maybe what his influence is on this Bears defense? So, like, let's start from like a philosophical, like, aggressiveness standpoint. Like, how aggressive was a pass rush from the Buffalo Bills defensively? How much are they coming downhill, or how much of it was we're rushing 4 and we're letting everybody else drop back?
Yeah, the Bills' pass rush statistically this year was very good. If I'm not mistaken, the top 3 in total sacks and maybe number 2 or 3 in percentage of plays that are sacked. So, like, that's certainly a good story to tell there. They are an up the field defense, right? They are an attack style single gap. They live in nickel, right? So it's basically a 4-2-5 defense. That's their bread and butter. And I think this past year under McDermott, you saw them blitz a little bit more. And dialing into a lot of simulated pressures, that type of thing. So I would anticipate even front, base nickel, simulated pressures, and some situations with blitzing. But I thought they did a good job with a lot of their contain rush. I think my favorite thing about the Bills' defensive line was the confidence that I had in them to face mobile quarterbacks and keep them contained. Like the Lamar Jacksons. Patrick Mahomes is another story, but they certainly, I thought they had a really good plan for him in their regular season game this year, where they actually sent a lot of 5-man pressures and tried to force him to play within structure more and less, creativity, and really just kind of cage rush. They have a lot of good things like that, and some of their games and twists and stunts that they run up front are very good and timely as well. And I think part of the benefit that Eric Washington and Sean McDermott have had with the defense is a lot of continuity of personnel. And so you think about defensive line, and it is about a guy being able to win one-on-one, but it's also the group rushing together and, right, being able to play off of each other and timing and understanding, where that pocket's going to be vulnerable. And I thought this was the year where I felt for the most part that showed itself in the best possible way for the Bills on defense.
What about their gap integrity in the running game? And I know when we had talked about Tremaine Edmonds with you last offseason, you talked about how, defensive line of Buffalo started to be a little bit more consistent, kept him freer.
Yeah.
And that's when you saw Tremaine Edmonds have some of his best years there. So I imagine, but I guess some of that can be talent versus, scheme and coaching. So I guess how would you evaluate that group up front and just being able to not necessarily always be in the backfield making the big play, but at least kind of filling their gaps and redirecting the run where it's supposed to go?
I think generally pretty good. I think the Bills have, throughout their time with McDermott and, of course, Eric Washington, have been willing to concede something on the ground. Like their base nickel 4-2-5. You saw it against Kansas City. They ran 12 and 13 personnel and they stayed in nickel the whole time, right? So they're going to concede some things from time to time. And there's going to be those moments where, like, on a snap-to-snap basis, the Bills' run defense is actually very good. The problem is they do have that moment every once in a while where they get gashed and give up some explosive runs. But it felt like whenever the Bills wanted to defend the run, they would. But there are also plenty of times where they're like, okay, come get these rushing yards. We'll let you have them. And so they would kind of pick their poison at times with that.
Well, Joe, it seems like every offseason now we're having a big Bills edition coming to the Chicago Bears. I'm not sure who we're going to have to talk to you about next offseason, whoever's going to become available, but certainly we'll have you back on the next
Lauren,
time.
listen, the Bills have a bunch of free agent defensive linemen. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know, whether it's an AJ Epinesa or a Tim Settle or what, Daquan Jones, Leonard Floyd, if he's going back to Chicago, there's going to be some players that I'm sure Eric Washington's going to invite to come with him to Chicago, where I think there's probably some needs there on the D-line.
So we'll schedule the Shaq Lawson podcast for March. Sounds good.
Right.
Thanks so much, Joe. We'll do it again soon. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy to help you be at your best and take good care of your brain. We all need to get things off of our chest sometimes, especially the big things. It's one thing to be upset about your sports team or to have these sort of little more superficial gripes that, okay, you can kind of get over and work through on your own in life. But sometimes it's the really big problem that can just need a little bit of extra help with from a third-party person, someone who is sort of professional and neutral and can give you the positive feedback that you need in order to be your best self. Going to online therapy is a really important part of my own mental health regimen, and I highly recommend it for anyone who thinks they could use any sort of improvement for themselves. Like I say, you go to the gym not because your body's broken, but because you want your body to be stronger. I go to therapy not because my brain is broken, but because I want my brain to be stronger, and that's why I cannot recommend it enough. Therapy can be different for everyone, certainly. Most of us, though, have bigger problems than just our favorite sports teams, and it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking about giving therapy a try out BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thanks again to Joe Marino from Locked On Bills for joining us on the podcast today and giving his perspective here on Eric Washington. And I think it's important that we think about this hire of Washington as defensive coordinator a little bit differently than we think about and talked about Shane Waldron being hired as offensive coordinator. I mean, obviously, the job titles are at the same sort of hierarchical level on the coaching staff, but the responsibilities and duties of the offensive and defensive coordinators under Matt Eberflus right now are drastically different. And so I think it's important that when we hear Joe talk about Eric Washington, in both the good and the bad, we should probably lower our expectations or downplay how much we expect Eric Washington to influence everything, right? He's not going to come here and change this Bears defense to the Buffalo Bills defense, right? This is still Matt Eberflus's defense, Matt Eberflus's system, Matt Eberflus as the presumed play caller, unless he at some point decides to change that and give up play calling duties. But Matt Eberflus is going to call the plays on this defense. And so Washington isn't going to have his fingerprints like on game day on exactly what the calls are, how much the Bears blitz, how much the Bears stunt, how much this defensive line drops into coverage. I mean, at the end of the day, the good and the bad that we see from this Bears defense this season will fall back on Matt Eberflus. He will be responsible for the success and failure of this Bears defense. Eric Washington will have a significant influence on it, right? I'm not trying to downplay and say, oh, this is just a nobody job that won't do anything. Like, Eric Washington will be intimately involved in game planning in the week-to-week process, in overseeing all of the position coaches and making sure that players are being put in the best position to be successful. And at Matt Eberflus's season-ending press conference this year, right, he talked about the defensive coordinator being a role where it needs to be a guy that he can trust to kind of hand over the room, the defensive room, to the coordinator when Eberflus can't be there, or when Eberflus needs to be somewhere else. At a time when he needs to be over with the offense or working with the quarterbacks or whatever it is. This needs to be a guy that he can trust to like fill his shoes, to kind of take over. That sort of like second in command co-pilot, where the pilot is still the pilot. The pilot's flying the plane. The co-pilot sitting next to him doesn't have, the actual, I don't even call it a steering wheel in the airplane. I don't know what you call the handles that in the cockpit, that actually fly the plane. But like the co-pilot can take control of the plane if the pilot needs him to. The co-pilot knows how to fly the plane. There's a reason why you have a co-pilot and not just a flight attendant sitting next to the pilot. Like he's got to know how to fly the plane. But he's not exactly flying the plane until he needs to fly the plane. And that's kind of where Eric Washington is, right? He's much more the co-pilot of the defense, which is important. The co-pilot is checking all sorts of, your altitude levels and your air pressure. I don't know anything about pilots, but you know what I mean? Like the co-pilot is checking your meters and he's flipping your switches and pressing your buttons, whatever pilots do up front there. And like that's really important. And the pilot might not be able to do all that by himself and monitor everything that he needs, and has the co-pilot right there to really do that for him. And like that's where Eric Washington is going to be valuable, and where when we talk about the game planning and the philosophy and like how are we going to attack this defense and how are we going to use these players, like maybe if Washington wanted to blitz more from Buffalo and wanted to be more aggressive, like that's the kind of influence he could have. He's not going to overhaul how Matt Eberflus does it in Chicago, but like those are the kind of areas where he could have influences from a week to week standpoint. It's not going to be changing everything, and if the defense gets better or gets worse, like to me, I don't know that that's an Eric Washington reflection. It's going to be hard to measure exactly how successful or good Eric Washington is as Bears defensive coordinator, because they have a defensive line coach, Travis Smith, who's done a good job and is fairly well respected. So like if a guy like Gervon Dexter keeps developing and growing and this defensive line gets better as the time goes on, is that because of Eric Washington? Maybe, probably partially, but also probably partially the defensive line coach and how you split up that. And also credit belongs to Ryan Poles for the additions he makes, the more talent they get on the defensive line, drafting high players and free agency. Like that can be some of the credit too. So it's not like we blame or credit Washington for the defensive line success and the defense as a whole. Like if the defense takes a step back, how much of that is Matt Eberflus? How much of that is Eric Washington? I mean, how much of that is on each of them? I don't know that we'll ever quite be able to separate those two. Like I think back to Alan Williams as the defensive coordinator. I mean, obviously the way that ended, we still don't have open, clear answers to, but like in the year and the game or two that Alan Williams was the Bears defensive coordinator, do you have any clue whether he was doing a good job or a bad job as defensive coordinator? Not really. I mean, I don't know. Didn't seem like he was specifically making things worse. Like when the defense was too conservative or stuff, that was Matt Eberflus' fault, right? We all said, Eberflus needs to be better. This defense needs to be better. It was him. And Alan Williams was just kind of there sometimes, right? And so when Alan Williams leaves and then Eberflus takes back over some control there and gets things better, and doesn't hire a defensive coordinator, then he gets all the credit for it. So then Washington comes in. If they get worse, does that mean it's Washington's fault? I don't think so. If the defense plays great, though, does Washington deserve the credit for that if they were already playing great this season without him? I don't think so either. So that's why, I don't want to overreact in either positive or negative directions to anything we hear or learn about Eric Washington, because it's just going to be so hard to separate what he does. It's not to say he's not going to do anything. It's just going to be hard for us on the outside to really see and feel and measure the direct impact that Washington has. We'll hear from him as a defensive coordinator, as a face of the defense, a voice who does press conferences. And I'm looking forward to kind of hearing his approach and hearing from him and getting a better sense of what his philosophy and role is going to be in the Chicago Bears defense. But all of that is much different than, say, Shane Waldron as an offensive coordinator, who he's in charge of the offense. He's the pilot. Like Matt Eberflus is more of the offensive co-pilot. When Waldron's calling the plays, Waldron's putting together the game plan. Eberflus has input and influence on that, but he's not an offensive guy. He's never been. Like Luke Getsy was in control of that offense. That's why Luke Getsy was fired. Shane Waldron, it's his offense. He's got to be in charge of all that. That was the much more pivotal, important hire for Matt Eberflus. And Eric Washington is, well, again, I don't want to say it's not important who they put in that job. You could certainly put a bad coach in that job and bring your defense down in some ways if he's not organized, if he's not disciplined, if he's not growing and coaching these guys along the way. But to me, let's not feel too strongly about Eric Washington as either the secret to solving this defense or the guy who's going to bring this defense down. No, seems like he's got a decent reputation among players and teams. Seems like he's worked with some quality players. As Joe was saying, maybe a couple questions about how long it's taken to develop some guys there, but I've also heard from people that say, he's a really good teacher and really good, like, hold you accountable, discipline type guy. So we'll kind of have to wait and see on Washington. That's the kind of perspective I want to make sure we take as we start this new era of the Bears coaching staff under Eberflus with 2 new coordinators. I'd love to hear what you think about Eric Washington in this role. You can leave us a comment here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. This week, I'll be in Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl. As you're listening to this, or as this podcast comes out on Monday morning, I'll be on a flight down there, and we'll be down there with plenty of time to get a podcast and stuff up tomorrow. But our next 3 or 4 podcasts here, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday podcasts, because, the way the schedule works, will be from Mobile. Won't have the same background behind me, won't have the exact same microphone and at-home setup, but I got my to-go setup all together. We're going to have, I think we may have guests all 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday podcasts here. I'm still finalizing exactly the when, wheres, and who's there, but I've got some different names lined up, so it'll be different looking, maybe slightly different sounding. It's not going to be in my home studio. We'll be, on the road, but hey, we're going to get great content for you. We're going to have some fun conversations with friends of the show and people in person. The chemistry when you do a live in-person podcast is so much better than even like with Joe here, right, where we're in different rooms, we're talking virtually. Man, when you're in person, we're going to have a lot of fun this week in Mobile. We're going to talk NFL draft prospects. Bears are going to be down there coaching offensive and defensive lines. Ryan Poles will be there scouting players. Matt Eberflus will be there scouting players. We'll try and glean whatever we can. We always get a couple of insider nuggets there, like last year, seeing Luke Getsy around quite a bit after hours. Those were some fun times. So lots of goodies coming your way this week from the Senior Bowl. Tune back in for those podcasts, and you have to tune back in every single day for your next opportunity to bear down.